The night of the Wolfheart marking ceremony, Avenna Shadowridge stood near the stone arch of the great hall in a gown the colour of deep water and watched 300 wolves celebrate a choice that had been made without her. The hall was alive with drums, not soft background music, real drums, the kind the Wolfheart pack brought out for occasions that were meant to be remembered, deep and rhythmic, filling the stone hall from floor to ceiling with a sound you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. The firelight was gold and generous, throwing long moving shadows across the stone walls, across the cedar beams overhead, across the faces of wolves who had dressed for a celebration and arrived in a good mood and intended to stay in one. Garlands of white hawthorn hung from every pillar, or still carrying the faint, clean scent of the hillside they had been cut from that morning. The tables were long and covered in linen, heavy with food and wine, and the particular warmth that fills a room when an entire pack decides all at once that something good has happened and they are going to celebrate it properly. And at the center of all of it, radiant, real, undeniable, stood Zorinai Frostvale. She wore silver and ivory. Her dark hair was pinned with small white flowers, the kind that bloom only in early spring, that you had to go out into the morning cold to find. Xavion's mark rested on the inside of her left wrist like a declaration. Chosen, claimed, settled. She laughed at something one of the elder wolves said. She turned to receive congratulations from the next person, and the next. Or the room arranged itself around her the way rooms do, around someone who has just won something quietly, without anyone watching the fight, like a new sun that the whole solar system had already adjusted to orbiting. Avenna had come because not coming would have been its own kind of confession. She knew that. She had calculated it with the same precision she brought to border surveys and resource models. Absence carries a message, and she was not willing to send that message. She had stood in her room for 20 minutes before leaving the house, her hands still on the wooden rail of her wardrobe, her reflection steady in the glass, telling herself that grief was not the correct name for what she felt. What she felt was simply the absence of something she had never officially been given, and therefore could not officially lose. She had almost convinced herself by the time she arrived. Now she stood at the arch, holding a goblet she had not drunk from, and she watched Zorinai be celebrated. And she told herself, again, quietly, firmly, with the focus of long practice, that she felt nothing in particular. Which was how she knew she felt everything. She had always been good at knowing things she did not want to know. It was part of the same quality that made her good at border surveys, the inability to look at evidence and see something other than what was there. Most people could look at a set of numbers and find the version that gave them the answer they were hoping for. Avenna had never been able to do that. She saw what was there. No, she had seen it at 2 in the morning in the war room, when Xavion's hand was close to hers on the map table, and he laughed at something she said with his eyes bright and the lamplight warm on both of them. She had seen it and named it correctly and filed it under. Not available. Not yours. Not safe to say out loud. She had been very disciplined about it for 2 years. She was being disciplined about it right now, standing at the arch in the dark, water-blue gown, watching the gold light of the celebration arrange itself around Zorinai Frostvale like a painting that had already been decided. 8 weeks ago, Xavion had called her to the war room. He had used the voice he reserved for decisions already made, careful and level, every trace of uncertainty worn smooth, of the voice of a man who has rehearsed the sentence until nothing raw remains in it. He had told her he had chosen Zorinai Frostvale. He had said it with his eyes on her face and his posture entirely composed, and she had kept her hands flat on the territory maps spread across the table in front of her. Flat, still, controlled, so they would not reveal their condition. And she had said, "I understand." She had meant it as a fortress. The word understand, said without any modifiers around it, was supposed to convey, I am processing this information. I will manage it. I will not require anything from you right now. It was supposed to close the door on the conversation without slamming it. The pack chose to read it as surrender, as a graceful acceptance, as the moment when Avenna Shadowridge showed that she was mature and professional and had never expected anything different. The difference between what she meant and what they heard mattered enormously to her, and not at all to anyone else. In the weeks that followed, she had watched the pack quietly rearrange its understanding of who she was. She was no longer the Alpha King's most trusted strategist, the one whose maps got pinned to the war room wall, whose numbers went before the council, whose 3 winters of border survey data formed the foundation of every major resource decision in the past 2 years. She was now the difficult one, the one who had not taken the news with sufficient grace. Not cruel, the pack was not cruel about it. They were simply consistent. Difficult. That word, traveling quietly ahead of her name, they're following her into every room she entered. As though the problem had always been her, had always been her refusal to be easy, had always been something she had done to herself by being too precise and too persistent and too clearly invested in outcomes that other people were content to estimate from a comfortable distance. She could not be angry at the pack for misreading her. She had never given them enough information to read correctly. Her own armor was her own fault. She was clear-eyed about that, even if it was a clarity she would have preferred not to have. She was still standing there, straight-backed, expression perfectly composed, holding a full goblet she had not touched, when Zorine Frostvale glided across the floor toward her. Zorine moved through rooms the way water moves, around obstacles, always forward, but always arriving exactly where she intended to arrive, with the appearance of someone who simply happened to end up there. Her expression was warm. Her hands were extended before she was even close enough for a proper greeting, and she spoke in a voice pitched just loud enough for the wolves standing nearby to hear every syllable without appearing to lean in. Avenna, I have been looking for you all evening. I wanted to say, you have been so brave about everything. Truly. The room heard. The room always heard exactly what it was meant to hear. 3 wolves near the fireplace turned their heads. An elder near the far table glanced over with the particular expression of someone who is pretending not to listen while listening closely. And somewhere in the subtle architecture of pack social standing, the architecture that is never spoken and never written down and functions more reliably than any council vote, a stone shifted. Avenna was no longer the wronged party. She was the one who had needed to be complimented on her bravery, the one who required acknowledgement for surviving something that gracious, capable people simply survived without a fuss. Avenna looked at Zorine steadily. She took the offered hands. She held them for the length of exactly the right pause, not too short, which would be a flinch, and not too long, which would be a statement. And she said, "Thank you, Zorine." Nothing else. There was nothing else available to her that would not make it worse. Zorine knew that she knew it. For one clear, unhurried second, they looked at each other across the hand clasp with the complete mutual understanding of 2 women who have never liked each other and have always been perfectly polite, and who are both fully aware of exactly what just happened and are choosing, for separate reasons, not to name it. Then Zorine released her hands, turned back to the celebration, and the room turned with her the way rooms do, smoothly, without drama, as though nothing had occurred worth discussing. The drums continued, the laughter continued, the firelight continued being gold and generous. Avenna set her goblet on the nearest table, still full, not a sip taken, and left through the eastern corridor. Not the main doors. The main doors meant passing the Elder Council's table, and she would not give the evening any further material to work with. As she walked through the eastern corridor, past the storage rooms, past the map alcove, past the narrow window that looked out onto the dark courtyard, and out through the side door into the spring night. The air outside was sharp and clean and asked nothing of her. The ground under her boots was solid and familiar. The stars above the Shadow Ridge trees were clear and cold and entirely indifferent to what had just happened in the great hall behind her. There was no one to watch her, no one to read the set of her shoulders, no one to note the quality of her silence as she walked away from the celebration and back across the pack grounds toward her own territory. She walked alone through the dark, and she thought about the border school she had spent 2 winters designing, the resource model for the 3 border clans, but the orphan wolf housing allocations she had built from the ground up because the existing system had a structural flaw nobody else had noticed. She had noticed it on a Tuesday morning in the war room while reviewing figures that everyone else considered settled, and she had spent the next 4 months redesigning the whole framework from scratch. She had not told anyone what she was doing until the new model was finished, and she could lay it on the table with every number defended and every projection backed by 3 separate sources. That program would feed children this winter. It would house wolves who had been sleeping in borrowed rooms and borrowed patients for years. It was real and solid and built, and it was going to work. She knew it the way she knew anything built on honest ground, not from hope, but from the arithmetic. And the pack had celebrated Xavian for it. She kept walking. The trees began, and the path went darker, and she knew every route and every turning of it, and she did not slow down. She had been the one who found the flaw in the Eastern Territory Survey, the one that would have cost the pack 40 acres of woodland if it had gone before the High Council without correction. She had found it on a Wednesday afternoon, worked through it for 6 hours to be sure she was right, and brought it to Xavian that evening. He had listened. He had understood. The next council report corrected the boundary in his own name, in his own voice, with no footnote. Not because he had stolen it from her, because it had not occurred to him that claiming her correction publicly meant claiming her. She had told herself, that evening and in the mornings after, that it didn't matter. The work mattered. The outcome mattered. The border families having enough to eat this winter mattered. Whether her name appeared on the document mattered significantly less than those things. She was still telling herself that. But the telling was getting harder. The Shadow Ridge house came into view through the trees, solid and familiar, the light on in her father's room, warm and yellow in the single window, the same light that had been on in that window her entire life whenever she came home late from something difficult. He never slept early. He said it was because the nights had gotten interesting. She had long suspected it was simply because she had come home late too many times, and he had stopped expecting her to be on time and started waiting instead. She let herself in through the side door. The hallway was dark. The house smelled like wood smoke and old books, and the particular quietness of a building that has held the same family for a very long time. She went to make tea. Her hands needed something to do, and tea was something she could do with her hands that did not require her to explain anything to anyone. Erindor Shadow Ridge had been a pack elder for 30 years. He had sat at more council tables than he could count, and argued more boundary disputes than he cared to remember. He had watched wolves make every kind of mistake that wolves make. The loud ones and the quiet ones, the ones born from anger, and the ones born from an inability to say a plain thing plainly. He knew them all. He had made several of them himself. He was older now, and slower, and the ailing that had settled into his joints 2 winters ago showed no interest in leaving. He moved through the house with deliberate economy, spending what he had carefully, not wasting anything on display. His voice had gone quieter, his opinions had gone sharper, but his eyes were what they had always been. The years had left those entirely alone. He was sitting beside the fire in the low-backed chair that fit his back better than anything else in the house, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside him, a book open and unread in his lap, when Avenna came in. He did not speak. He watched her cross the room to the kitchen. He heard the kettle. He heard the quality of silence she made while the water heated, a particular, careful silence, the kind that takes effort to maintain, the kind that is not actually silence at all, but the controlled version of something considerably louder. He waited. He was practiced at waiting. She came back with 2 cups, sat in the chair across from him, wrapped both hands around her cup the way she had done since she was small, and looked into the fire. He gave her a few minutes. The fire worked its way through a log. The spring night pressed quietly against the window glass. Outside, somewhere distant across the pack grounds, the celebration drums were a faint rhythm, present but removed, like something happening in another country. Then he said, "Tell me about your mother." She looked at him. "What?" "You never knew her the way I knew her," he said. "You were too young. Sit with me. I want to tell you something about her tonight." She was still for a moment. Then she settled back in her chair. "All right," she said. He took a sip of cooling tea. "She was cleverer than me," he said, "by a considerable margin. She knew it. I knew it. The entire pack knew it, and nobody said anything about it, because she never once made anyone feel the weight of the difference. She could hold 5 arguments in her head at the same time and tell you why all 5 of them were wrong before you had finished stating the first one. She had opinions about everything. She gave those opinions to anyone who asked, and sometimes to people who had not asked, but who she could see were about to make a costly mistake." The fire settled into its next stage. Erindor looked at it. "I was afraid of her for the first 3 months," he said, "not because she was frightening, because she was so clear. You could not be approximate around her. She looked at a situation and saw it as it was, not as you wished it were, not as you told yourself it might be with a little more time. Just what it was. The plain thing, named plainly, and the plain truth, when it is correct, and someone else says it before you have managed to prepare yourself for it, is the most unsettling thing in the world." Avenna was looking at him now, her cup forgotten, both hands still around it. "You loved her for that," she said. "Desperately," he said. "But not right away. First I spent 3 months watching her from across whatever room she was in, telling myself she would never look at a man like me seriously, that a woman who could see things that clearly would want someone equally clear, that she would not have patience for a man who needed 2 months of preparation before he could say what he actually meant." He paused. The fire was very quiet. "She came to me," he said. "She came across the room at a border council meeting, the one about the Northern Creek allocation, which went on for 4 hours and was a terrible meeting. And she sat down next to me, and she said, "I have been watching you think about talking to me for 2 months. I would like you to know that I would not object." Avenna was very still in her chair. "She just said it," she said. Not a question. She just said it. The plain sentence, without a strategy around it, without a case built to protect herself in case the answer was wrong. She looked at what she wanted, and she trusted herself enough to say it out loud. And she trusted me enough to let me hear it without the armor on. He looked at his daughter steadily. "You build cases, Avenna. You have always built them. You build them better than any elder I have ever watched work. But what you actually want, what you want underneath the strategy, underneath the survey data, underneath the argument constructed to protect yourself from having to say the small, vulnerable, undefended thing that you will not say. You give people the evidence. You give them every figure they need to reach the correct conclusion. But the conclusion itself, in plain words, you will not say. You make everyone decode it. And some people, even people who are genuinely trying, are not good enough at decoding the thing you refuse to name." Avenna did not answer immediately. The fire said nothing useful. Outside, the distant drums from the celebration had gone quiet. "He should have been," she said at last. "He was in that room with me for 2 years. He should have learned to read it." "Yes," Erindor said, without hesitation, without softening. "He should have been. That failure belongs to him, and I am not asking you to make it smaller or carry it differently than it deserves to be carried." He paused for one beat. "But you had the ability to help him, and you chose not to. You could have said the plain sentence, the way your mother said it, and given him a fair chance to be good enough. And you decided the risk of that was too great. That part, only that part, is yours." She looked at the fire for a long time. She thought about 2 years of late nights in the war room, the smell of parchment and pine resin, of the particular way the lamplight sat on the map table at 2 in the morning, when both of them were still there, and the rest of the pack had long since gone to bed. The way he argued with her figures, and was almost always wrong on the first pass, and almost always understood on the second, if she walked him through the reasoning clearly enough. The look that crossed his face when the correct answer finally landed. The quiet, attentive look of a man who has genuinely understood something and is not yet sure what to do with it. She had called that productive. For 2 years she had called it productive, and gone home and kept her hand steady all the way across the pack grounds. "She was braver than me," Avenna said. "No," Erindor said gently, with the certainty of a man who had thought about this many times. "She was equally afraid. The difference was that she was willing to lose control of the outcome. She was willing to say the thing and not know how it would land, and live with that uncertainty, rather than protect herself from it." He picked up his cup. "That is not bravery, exactly. It is a decision. It is a choice you make when you decide that being honest with someone you love matters more than being safe. You can make that choice whenever you are ready." Avenna finished her teal in silence. She went to bed late, and the border survey maps were spread on the desk in the corner of her room. Both sets of handwriting, the record of 2 years laid flat in the lamplight, waiting in the way things wait that are not yet finished. She did not move them. On a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the marking ceremony, and the published proceedings of the High Council were distributed to all senior pack members. Avenna received her copy with the rest of the morning correspondence. She set it beside her tea, opened it, and began reading with the focused attention she gave any council document. She was looking for inconsistencies in the figures, places where the reasoning skipped a step, claims that needed a second source before they could hold their weight. She had been doing this for so long, it was simply how she read now. Everything with that particular quality of attention that is looking for the place where someone got comfortable and stopped checking. By the third page, something had changed in her chest. Not a feeling exactly, more like a change in temperature. Something going cold and settling. By the fifth page, then she had placed the document flat on the desk with both hands and was looking at the wall. Her Border Clan resource models were in the proceedings, every line of them, in sequence, in the order she had developed them. The per-household allocation figures she had worked out across 2 winters of walking the actual ground and counting the actual people, and not estimating from a comfortable distance. The orphan wolf housing model she had built from scratch, because the existing system had a structural flaw nobody had noticed. The territory school proposal, the one she had redesigned 4 times before the reasoning was tight enough to put before a council. The phased implementation structure, with its careful sequencing of which program launched first and why. The arguments she had spent 3 months developing about the relationship between border security tenure and long-term pack productivity. Every word of it. In Xavian's voice. In Xavian's name, presented to the most powerful wolves in the region as the Alpha King's strategic vision for the pack's future. No footnote, no credit, no single acknowledgement that the work had come from anywhere except him. She sat with the document for a long time. She did not tear it. Not tearing it cost her more than tearing it would have, because tearing it would have been a release, and she did not permit herself releases she could not justify. She did not send a message to the Wolfheart estate. She did not write a letter to the council. She filed the proceedings in the record box beside her border maps. Her handwriting visible on every page of those maps is on every page of that council record, and she put her hands flat on top of the closed box and she breathed. It was not malice. She was honest enough with herself to name that clearly. There was no calculation behind this, no deliberate decision to take what was hers and present it as his. It was something quieter, and in some ways harder to address. The simple, unexamined assumption of a man who had never once had to consider that claiming her work publicly might mean something more than administrative convenience, who had sat beside her for 2 years and taken her thinking with genuine seriousness inside the war room, and then walked outside it and let the world see only one name without ever pausing to consider whether that was the full truth of what had happened. She sat with that understanding for a while. It was not comfortable. Or then she heard the knock at the front door. Zorine arrived in the soft wool coat she wore for social visits, carrying a small tin of pastries from the estate kitchen and the warm concern of a woman who had decided that generosity was the most powerful position available to her. She sat in the Shadow Ridge receiving room and arranged herself comfortably and looked at Avenna with the careful gentleness of someone who has prepared her words and is delivering them on schedule. She told Avenna about Cavion Ashbourne, Northern Territory Beta, solid, patient, kind in a way that did not require much in return. He had expressed interest in courting Avenna. It would be good for her to have someone to be seen with. It would help the pack see that she was well, that she was moving forward, or that the story had reached its natural conclusion, and everyone could stop watching for what happened next. Avenna looked at Zorine. She thought about the council proceedings in the record box on the shelf behind her. She thought about 3 years of her handwriting, now traveling the region under a different name. She thought about her father's fire and the plain sentence. And she said, with perfect, even calm, "Stop managing my loneliness. You are not that generous, and I am not that broken. Cavion is a kind man. He deserves someone who wants what he is offering. I am not that person, and we would both understand that within a fortnight. I do not need a match arranged to make the pack comfortable. I need you to stop calling this kindness. Zorine stood. Her composure was as complete as it always was, but her hands were very still at her sides, held with that deliberate, particular stillness that is not natural, that costs something. I am trying to help, she said. You are trying to close the chapter, Avenna said. There is a difference. The door closed behind Zorine with the careful, quiet click of someone who has decided not to say the last word they thought of on the way out. The receiving room was still. Avenna sat in it for a while without moving. The fire in the corner went through its quiet work. The spring afternoon outside the window was pale and indifferent. That evening, she opened the border survey maps. She had been telling herself for weeks that she opened them for work purposes, that she needed to review the figures, that the documentation required attention. Those things were all partially true, and she knew they were also not the full truth, and she sat with both facts the way she sat with any inconvenient evidence, steadily, without looking away. His handwriting was next to hers on every page. 2 years of their shared work, the places where he had been wrong and she had corrected him, the places where she had been uncertain and he had sat across the table and argued with her until they worked it out together, the places where something had clicked and they had both gone quiet at the same moment, recognizing that the answer was right before either of them said it aloud. She could not make herself put the maps away. She sat in the lamplight with both hands resting on the desk and looked at the evidence of 2 years. She did not examine everything she felt about what she was looking at. She simply noted that she was still there, still at this desk, still looking, at the end of a day that had already asked more of her than most. She noted that this was information about something she had not yet decided what to do with. The Emergency Territory Council meeting was held on a Wednesday morning in the Wolfhart Estate's main chamber. High ceilings, stone walls, fires at both ends, the long table down the center, with chairs for the elders and the senior advisors and the Resource Allocation Board. The kind of room that had been built to hold serious decisions, and that held them the way such rooms do, without comment, without comfort. Avenna arrived early, the way she always did. She spread the survey maps on the table herself, using the small lead weights from her satchel to anchor the corners against the drafts from the high windows. And she sat in her chair and reviewed the figures while the room filled around her. The council members came in, the elders, the senior advisors. Then Xavian, in the formal, dark coat, composed in the way he was always composed in rooms where consequences were present. And then Zorine Frostvale, taking the seat that had been prepared for her on the Resource Allocation Board, the new seat, the one that existed because of the mark on her wrist, because of a ceremony that had been celebrated 3 weeks ago in gold firelight and hawthorn garlands. The meeting came to order. Other business proceeded. Then Zorine tabled her motion. She spoke carefully and well. She had prepared. Her language was neutral and credible. Efficiency, proven track record, responsible stewardship of pack resources. The city shelter had served wolves for 12 years. Its outcomes were documented, its governance established, its infrastructure already built. The Border Clan school program, while admirable in its intentions, was ambitious and unproven. Redirecting resources to an established institution was the rational choice. She framed it as modernization. The room heard it as something slightly different from modernization, but the room didn't say that, because the room rarely said the thing it actually heard. Avenna looked at the maps on the table. Then Xavier reached across and picked up the edge of the northern boundary survey, the one with Avena's corrections across the lower third, her dark ink and her precise, impatient handwriting, her annotations in the margins, and he held it where the room could see it, and he began to read. Her annotations, her calculations, her fieldwork figures from 16 months of walking the actual territory, counting the actual families, calculating the actual numbers rather than estimating from the comfort of the estate library. He read in a steady voice, and he attributed everything, her surveys, her models, her data, the 3 years of evidence that the school program was not ambitious, but necessary. He read for 5 minutes. The room could see 2 sets of handwriting on every map. The room understood what it was looking at. He set the map down. Zorine's motion was called for a vote. Xavier did not speak against it. He did not speak for it. He sat with his hands flat on the table, his face composed, and he said nothing. Avena felt it land, not like a blow exactly, more like a recognition. What a thing she had suspected, without admitting she suspected it, suddenly confirmed. She had expected something different from him. She had not let herself know she expected it, and now she knew because the expectation had not been met. She picked up the north boundary map. She stood up. She defended the school program from the evidence for 11 minutes. She was precise and clear, and there was no feeling in her voice, because her voice was the only instrument she had in this room, and she would not spend any of it on anything that was not the argument. She moved through the data from the first figure to the last, addressed every point in Zorine's motion, answered each one with numbers that had been checked against the ground and against 3 separate sources. She did not raise her voice. She did not look at Xavier. The council voted, or the school program was retained. She gathered the maps, carefully, methodically, rolling them and replacing the lead weights in her satchel, and she walked out of the chamber without looking at him. She walked down the corridor of the Wolfhart estate, past portraits and windows and the quiet, indifferent stone, and out through the main door onto the path, and the spring afternoon received her without comment. She walked home across the packed grounds, and the sky was pale and wide and gave her nothing to argue with. She was not in pieces. She had not expected to be. She was simply more certain than she had been before about the shape of something she had been trying not to name. He had given her what she was owed, in public, before the council. He had held her maps and read her work, and made the attribution clear. But that was real, and it was not nothing. And then he had sat in silence, while someone moved to dismantle the work those maps had built. And he had said nothing, and that was also real. She held both things. She walked home. She did not find a way to make them comfortable. That evening in the war room, the lamps burned low, and the maps were on the wall, and Xavier stood alone in the quiet, with his right hand raised, his finger tracing an annotation in her handwriting. He had never told anyone to take the maps down. Standing there in the lamplight, he understood for the first time that this had been a decision, a choice he had been making, quietly, every day, by not making any other choice. He had left her handwriting on his walls. He had left the evidence of 2 years of shared work visible in the room where he made his decisions. He had not examined why. He was examining it now. He moved his finger along the line of her writing, her corrections in dark ink, her annotations in the margins, the note in the upper corner of the north boundary map that he had read more times than he could count. He measured from the ridge. Walk the actual line. It is wrong by 60 yards, and it matters. He had read that as a survey correction. He had fixed the measurement. He had filed the updated figure. Standing alone in the lamplight, he understood that it was not a survey correction. She had been in this room with him for 2 years, and she had been saying something in every argument, behind every correction, underneath every late-night conversation they had ever had about boundary lines and resource models, something that had nothing to do with the measurements, and something he had not listened for, because he had been too comfortable with the layer he could hear. He had proposed to Zorinai 4 weeks after Ravenna wrote that note. Standing here now, he examined that timing for the first time. He found it uncomfortable. He did not look away from it. He left the maps on the wall. He went to bed. He did not sleep well, and he knew exactly why. 3 days before the night of the marking ceremony, Avenna came back to the Wolfheart War Room to retrieve a border survey she had left there in winter. This is what she told herself. She was thorough about it. She needed the survey for the school program records. The documentation was incomplete without it. It was a matter of administrative accuracy. Or she walked through the reasoning with the same discipline she applied to any argument she was not fully sure of, checking each step, making certain the conclusion held, not letting herself look at what the argument was protecting. She came through the eastern corridor the way she always had. The housekeeper had never revoked the arrangement, and she had not thought to ask whether anything had changed. She walked the familiar hallway. 10 steps from the side door to the turn, 6 more to the war room, and she opened the door. Xavian was at the map wall. His back was to her. His right hand was raised. His finger was on the north boundary map, the one with her corrections in the lower third, her annotation in the upper corner, and he was not moving. He was standing in the late afternoon light, very still, and reading her words the way you read something you keep returning to because you haven't yet fully understood what it means. He did not hear her come in. Avenna stood in the doorway. She read her own handwriting over his shoulder. He measured from the ridge. Walk the actual line. It is wrong by 60 yards, and it matters. She could see exactly where his finger was resting, on the line between wrong and matters, the 4 words that were the real point of the note. She breathed slowly, evenly, with the focused discipline of a woman who has spent 2 years practicing stillness in this particular room. She crossed the floor. She did not announce herself. She moved into the room quietly, covered the distance to the map wall, and stood behind him, close enough to read the annotations at the same level as his eyes. Neither of them spoke, or neither of them moved for a moment. The war room held them both in its familiar quiet, the lamplight, the parchment smell, the cold of stone walls in late afternoon, the distant sound of the pack grounds going about their ordinary business outside. Then she reached past him, her arm alongside his for the length of 2 sentences. She pointed to a figure in the lower corner of the map. "That allocation figure is wrong," she said. "I wrote it late in the winter, working quickly, and I miscalculated the per-household amount. The corrected version is in the file on the left shelf." Her arm was beside his for those 2 sentences, not touching, precisely adjacent. Then she withdrew it. She crossed to the shelf. She found the file she had named. The survey she had come for was beside it, which she had known, if she was honest, or it was approximately where it would be. She had not come for the file. She had come for the survey. She picked up the survey. She had touched the map before she touched the survey. She noted that, and she did not make it larger than it was. She left without looking back. The corridor was cold. Her hands were entirely steady, the whole way down the hall and out through the eastern door and across the pack grounds and through the Shadowridge trees and home. Her hands were steady all the way. Back in the war room, Xavian did not move for a long time. The room held the shape of what had just happened, the particular quality of silence left behind when someone has been present very briefly and then gone, like a temperature change in a room where the window has just been opened and closed. He stood at the map wall. He looked at the annotation his finger was still touching. Walk the actual line. She had walked into his room and stood behind him and pointed at a figure and said the figure was wrong, and then walked out. She had done it without a single extra word, without anything that could be read as sentiment or admission or anything other than a woman returning to a room on an errand. But her arm had been alongside his for the length of 2 sentences, and she had touched the map before the survey she had ostensibly come for, and he knew, standing there alone with those 2 facts, that she had been saying something in this room for 2 years, and he had been listening to the wrong layer of every word. He had been measuring from the ridge. He had been estimating from a comfortable distance, calling it knowing, calling it understanding, to calling it the natural result of 2 years of shared work. He had not walked the actual line. 3 days from now, he would set down his goblet at his own marking ceremony and cross the floor of the great hall, and the story would have arrived at the place it had been moving toward for 2 years. He was not there yet. He stood in the lamplight, alone with the maps and the evidence and the specific understanding that had arrived too late to be comfortable. He stood there for a long time. Below the war room, the celebration was at its full height. 300 wolves, the drums playing their deep rhythm, the great hall full of light and noise, and the particular aliveness of a pack gathered to mark something. Zorine at the center of it, genuinely radiant, her laughter real, her happiness earned, a woman who had wanted something, but had moved carefully and purposefully toward it, and had arrived. Whatever came after, this moment was real and hers. Avenna had been standing at the stone arch with her full goblet and her composed expression for a period she had decided in advance was long enough to constitute attendance. She had spoken with 4 senior wolves. She had been offered congratulations that were actually condolences wrapped in congratulations, and she had received them with composure that had cost something real. She had been given a compliment on her bravery by the marked mate in front of witnesses, and she had returned that with 2 words and nothing more. She had done enough. She had done more than enough. And there is a limit to what composure can hold, and she had found it. She left through the eastern corridor. She told herself she was returning the border survey to the war room file where it belonged. Documentation. Administrative accuracy. The record should be complete. She came in through the eastern corridor, let herself into the war room, set the survey on the shelf, and stood at the map table. She did not leave. The war room was exactly what it had always been. Exactly what it had been for 2 years. The stone walls, the lamplight, the parchment smell, the cold, the maps. Both sets of handwriting. The record of everything she and Xavier had argued about, and built and named accurately in this room, and refused to name entirely outside of it. The room that had held more honest conversation between them than any other place in either of their lives. She put her hands on the edge of the map table. The maps were under her hands, or the drums were below. The celebration was below. The life that had been arranged and was proceeding according to its plan was below. In here, it was quiet. The door opened. He was still in his ceremonial dark coat. His composure was present. It was always present in Xavier. It was one of the things she had argued with and relied on, and occasionally wanted to shake loose from him. But it was thinner tonight than she had ever seen it. The composure of a man who has spent an entire evening maintaining something at a cost he can feel. They looked at each other across the map table. "You are in my war room," he said. "I was returning a survey." I put it on the shelf. She did not move from the table. Your steward should have taken these maps down before tonight. Azorine's guests do not need to see both sets of handwriting on every territory in the Packlands. I told him to leave them. She turned then, fully, looking at him across the table. Why? Because they are the most honest thing in this house. The room was quiet between them for a long moment. Below, the drums. Above, the stone ceiling. Between them, the maps with their 2-year record, their corrections and annotations, and the evidence of everything they had done together in this room. Zorina is in that hall wearing your mark, she said. Whatever this is, whatever has brought you to this room tonight, nothing about that has changed. She is real. Your commitment to her is real. I know what is real, he said. I know the weight of what I asked her to carry. He moved to the table, not to her, and so the map stayed between them. She asked me once what I think about at midnight. I told her the Eastern Treaty revision. She believed me. She trusted that answer because I had never given her a reason not to. She trusts a man who told her a partial truth, Avenna said. Yes. He looked at her steadily. And the other half of the truth is standing here in a dark blue gown, refusing to say what she wants. Avenna was still. He went on, and his voice was not careful anymore. It was the voice of a man who has exhausted his constructed responses and arrived at the one that was always underneath them. You argued every border dispute and resource model in this pack with the intensity of a woman who has staked everything on the outcome, he said. You corrected my survey measurements at 2 a.m. While you walked lines, I estimated, and came back with numbers that proved I was wrong every single time. You found the eastern boundary flaw and wrote 4 words in the margin and walked home without saying anything else. You made yourself completely indispensable to the work I did in this room, and completely invisible to everything I did outside of it. And when I was too afraid to reach for you, you told Zorine the truth about what easier meant and called it honesty. It was honest, Avenna said. Half of it was honest. The other half is that you would rather be right about my failure than risk saying what you actually wanted. You would rather say he chose easier than say I wanted him to choose me. Because saying that, saying the plain thing, without the case built around it first, or without the argument assembled to protect you if the answer is wrong, is the one thing your entire life is arranged to avoid. Her hands tightened on the table's edge, just slightly, just enough to be visible. She stood very still, and she let his words land without deflecting them. She thought about her father beside the fire. She thought about her mother sitting down at a council meeting and saying the plain sentence without the fortress around it first. She thought about what it had cost her mother to be that open, what it had cost her father to hear it, what it had cost them both to stand in the open without armor and let the other person see them clearly. She thought about what it would cost her to do that now. She thought about what it was already costing her not to. Because you chose the woman who would never write, walk the actual line in your margin, she said. Because being truly seen by someone, being corrected by someone who loves you enough to care whether you are wrong, is what you could not bear. Yes, he said. One word. No qualification, no softening of it. He stood there and received it without deflecting it, without finding a more comfortable version of it to hold instead. The room was quiet. Avenna let go of the table's edge. She breathed once, slowly, and she said it. She said it without building the case first, without the strategy assembled around it, without the armor she had spent 24 years constructing around the one sentence she could not afford to say without losing the control her entire life was built on. She opened her hands and let the most undefended truth she had ever held go out into the open air of the room. I wanted you to choose me. 7 words, no fortress around them, no argument defending them, no precision holding them at a safe distance. 7 words, said plainly, the way her mother had known how to say things, and she had spent her whole life being afraid to say them. Below, the drums continued. The great hall continued. 300 wolves and 1 celebration continued in the complete indifference of things that do not know what is happening in the room above them. None of it touched the silence that received those 7 words in the war room. Xavier looked at her across the map table. I choose you, he said. Not because you are difficult, not because you are useful to my work, because you are the only person in my life who has ever made me want to deserve being known by you. That is not a small thing. That is the thing. The silence between them was long and unhurried. Avena's hands rested flat on the maps, not gripping, not braced, simply resting. The first time in 2 years they had done that without effort. That is not enough tonight, she said. Tonight, Zorina is in that hall wearing your mark, and she is not a consolation prize, and she is not a mistake. She is a woman who loved you genuinely, and she deserves the plain truth from you before she deserves anything else. Go and tell her. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Without constructing the explanation first. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he moved toward the door. He stopped. He turned back. He crossed the room. Not with drama, not with urgency, but with the particular deliberate care of a man who is very certain about one thing, and he stood close to her, and the moment between them was quiet and real, and exactly what it was, and her hands stayed flat on the maps throughout, simply resting. Then she said quietly, "Go." He went. She stayed. The war room held her in its familiar silence, the maps under her hands, the lamplight on the annotations, the drums a faint rhythm below, the spring night around the stone walls, cold and dark and indifferent to everything that had just happened. She had said it. The plain sentence. In the open air, without armor, without a case built to catch herself if the answer was wrong. She had not broken. She hadn't known, before this moment, whether she would. Zorine Frostvale set the terms of the dissolution herself. Nobody suggested them, as nobody counseled her toward generosity or practicality or any of the more comfortable arrangements. She called Xavier to the library the morning after the ceremony, before the household was awake, before the pack had begun its day, before he could construct any particular version of what was going to happen next, and she told him precisely what the dissolution of the Mark bond would require from him. He would present himself to the High Council. He would deliver an address to the assembled elders. He would say plainly, not changed circumstances, not incompatibility, not the neutral language of mutual agreement that covers a multitude of private failures, that the dissolution was his fault, his failure. Named specifically and without softening, before every wolf who had stood in the great hall and witnessed the marking ceremony. He had stood in front of them and made a commitment, and he would stand in front of them again and tell them the truth about what that commitment had cost Zorine, and why the cost had been his to bear, rather than hers. Zorine was not warm when she said this, but she was not cruel either. She was precise. Precision, Xavier was learning, was what honesty looked like when it had genuine weight behind it. He had learned it from a woman in a dark blue gown with 2 years of ink on border maps, and now he was learning it again from a woman in a silver and ivory gown with a fresh mark on her wrist that she hadn't asked to have dissolved. He delivered the address before the High Council in a single draft. He did not revise it. He did not find careful language that said what was required while protecting his reputation. He did not qualify. He stood before the elders and named his failure specifically, the way Zorinai had required, the way truth required, and he paid the cost without negotiation. The address was 12 minutes long. He had written it in one sitting, in the war room, at the map table, with Avena's handwriting visible on every map pinned to the wall. He had not planned that. He had not chosen the war room for symbolic reasons. He had gone there because it was the room where he thought most clearly. He understood, sitting there with the pen in his hand and the blank page in front of him, why that was. The room had been used for honest thinking for 2 years. That quality had settled into the walls. He wrote 12 minutes of truth. He described what had happened clearly and without excuse, or he described what Zorinai had been asked to carry without full information. He did not ask for sympathy. He did not offer explanations that were really a form of defense. He said what was real, and he read it aloud, and he sat down. The council was quiet for a moment afterward. Then the senior elder said what was required for the dissolution to be recorded, and it was recorded, and Xavian walked out of the chamber and into the ordinary spring afternoon, and the pack began the slow adjustment it always made to things it had not predicted. The council acknowledged the dissolution. The pack adjusted its understanding of events. Slowly, in the particular way packs adjust to things they hadn't predicted, which involves a period of quiet resorting and very little open conversation. Zorinai Frostvale retained her standing as the Beta's daughter, which was real and hers and entirely independent of anything Xavian had given or failed to give her. She was not reduced by this. She had understood from the beginning that she was not reducible, and this remained true. 3 weeks after the council address, Zorinai wrote to Avena. 3 pages. Entirely without warmth. No pleasantries at the opening, no softening in the middle, no diplomatic close at the end. It was the most honest thing Zorinai had ever written, and it was honest in the way that things are honest when the writer has decided that performance is no longer worth the effort. She covered several things. She covered what she expected from the pack going forward. She covered her position with the Beta House and what she intended to do with it. And near the middle of the 2nd page she wrote, "Nyrex Ashford asked to court me last month. I said yes. He argues with me about whether the eastern courtyard needs a second garden. He has opinions about the stonework and the water feature, and the placement of the beds along the south wall. He has opinions about all of it, and he expresses them directly. I did not expect that. I find I do not mind." Near the end of the 3rd page, the last sentence before the signature, "You were right about easier. I did not enjoy writing that line. You will know that from the pressure of the pen." Avena read the line twice. She set the letter on the corner of the desk and looked at it for a while. Her understanding of Zorinai had shifted somewhere across those 3 pages, not into warmth, or which was not available between them, and neither of them would pretend otherwise, but into something cleaner and more durable. Zorinai was not a villain. She had never been one. She was a woman who had read a situation clearly, moved toward what she wanted without apology, been wronged in the process by someone else's inability to say the plain sentence before making promises, and was now writing 3 pages without warmth to say the truth about it. That was a kind of integrity, not the kind that made them friends, but the kind worth acknowledging. Avena wrote back. 1 page, careful and direct. She told Zorinai that she had never done anything quickly in her life, that the pressure of the pen had been received and noted, and that she hoped Nyrex Ashford's opinions about the Eastern Courtyard fountain were grounded in genuine aesthetic reasoning and not simply decoration. 2 days later, Xavian came to Shadow Ridge. Her territory, her house, her desk, her maps, her father's old chair by the fire that nobody sat in because nobody wanted to suggest it had been reassigned. He came in the early evening when the light through the Shadow Ridge trees was going gold and thin, and the spring was finally settling into something that felt like it had decided to stay. He knocked at the front door like an ordinary person and waited, which was something she noted because he had not done that before. He had always come in through the eastern door of the estate, had always been expected. He was not expected here. He was not assumed. He was asking. She opened the door. She looked at him standing on her step in the spring evening light. His coat not the ceremonial one, just an ordinary dark wool coat. His expression not composed exactly, but present. The expression of a man who has run out of constructed faces and is offering his actual one. She stepped back from the door to let him in. He came into the Shadow Ridge house slowly, looking at it the way you look at a place you have heard about and are seeing for the first time. The worn floors, the books stacked on every surface, the maps on the desk, the fire in the corner with the old chair beside it, the whole particular texture of a house that has held serious thought and honest conversation for a long time. He looked at Erendor's empty chair. "Your father?" he said. "Sleeping," she said. "He sleeps earlier these days." She went back to the desk and picked up her pen and then set it down again, because she was not actually going to annotate border records right now, and pretending otherwise was the kind of approximation she had just spent 2 years trying to stop making. She sat in her chair and looked at him. "It is done," he said. She set down her pen. "I know. Zorinai wrote to me." He stopped in the middle of the room. "She wrote to you. She sent me the terms before she sent them to anyone else. She told me that if I forgive you too quickly, she will never speak to me again." Avenna looked at him steadily. "She told me I was right about Easier. I could tell from the pressure of the pen that she did not enjoy writing it. What did you say in your reply?" "I told her I have never done anything quickly in my life." Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile. The expression that precedes one in a person who has understood that the woman in front of him is going to be exactly this person in every conversation they will ever have, and who finds that he has no objection to that at all. He sat down in the chair across from her desk, settling into it with the particular intention of someone who is choosing to be somewhere rather than simply arriving. "Tell me what this looks like," he said. "Not what you think should be said here. What this actually looks like." Avenna looked at him for a moment. "I will argue with your counsel's strategy when the reasoning is lazy," she said. "And your first drafts are frequently lazy. You know this about yourself. I know this about myself. I will tell you when your boundary surveys need more field work before they go into the record. Not to be right about it, because it matters whether the figures are correct, and I am not willing to pretend it is close enough when it is not." She met his eyes. "And I need you to stay in the argument, not manage it. Not find the version of what I said that is easier to agree with and use that instead. The actual argument, the one I am actually making, with all of it present. I need you to stay." "I will stay," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The fire in the corner was steady and warm. Outside, the spring evening was going gently dark. "You said something similar once to Zorinai," she said. "What I said to Zorinai, what I thought a person in that position was supposed to say," he said. He did not look away from her. "I am saying to you what I actually mean. I am still learning, that those two things are not the same, and that the difference between them is the only thing that matters. He paused. I am aware that is a significant thing to say to a woman who has been tracking the quality of my honesty for 2 years. It is, Avenna agreed, and I will be tracking it going forward as well. You should know that. I would be concerned if you weren't, he said. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about her mother at the council meeting saying the plain sentence. She thought about her father beside the fire saying, it is a decision, not bravery, a choice about what matters more than staying safe. She thought about 7 words said in a lamplight room above a celebration without a fortress around them, and how she had not broken. She picked up the North Border map from the desk, the one with her corrections, her annotation, her 4 words that had never been only about the survey. She turned it so he could see. This boundary is still wrong, she said. You revised it in the spring. I can see in the figures exactly where you stopped walking the line and started estimating. The numbers go round at the 3rd section. That does not happen when you do it properly. I walked the full length, he said. You walked to the 2nd marker and estimated the rest because it was getting late. I can see it in the smoothness of the figures. Something settled in his face, the expression of a man who has been caught estimating on the northern boundary by the one person who was always going to catch him, and who has discovered that being caught like this, by this person, in this arrangement, is not a problem. It is just the next conversation. Walk it with me, he said. Thursday. Come out to the northern boundary and walk the whole line with me and show me where I estimated. I always show you where you estimated, Avenna said. You do, he said. And I keep walking the line with you. That is what this is. She looked at him across the desk, across the map, across 2 years of evidence, and 1 night of plain sentences, and everything that had been built on the honest ground left afterward. She did not look away. That is what this is, she said. Weeks later, on an ordinary autumn morning, the Shadowridge Library held the particular quiet that belongs to 2 people working in the same room without needing to fill the silence between them. Outside, the trees were turning amber and rust, and the particular deep gold that only the Shadowridge land produced in October, as though it had more warmth stored in the soil than anywhere else in the Pack territory. The border school in the Coldbrook region was open and running. 12 children in 3 of its rooms, the winter supply stocks accumulating in the storage room, the first session of the education program proceeding exactly as the 3-year projections had said it would, not because the projections had been optimistic, but because they had been correct. Was an elder who had opposed the program for 2 years sent a letter of quiet congratulation that mentioned the outcomes and omitted the opposition. Avenna filed it without comment. Xavian, reading over her shoulder, said nothing, but she could tell from the change in his breathing that he wanted to say something. She did not invite him to. The maps were framed on the library wall, both sets of handwriting, preserved under glass, everything they had argued about and built and refused to name for 2 years, now kept as a record of something real. Her corrections in dark ink, his annotations in the hand that moved slightly rightward when he was working fast, the note in the upper corner of the north boundary map, visible even at this distance. He measured from the ridge. Walk the actual line. It is wrong by 60 yards, and it matters. Framed, not kept. Not because it was significant for the record, but because it was true, and they had decided that things that were true were worth keeping. Zorine's final letter arrived with the morning post. Nyrex Ashford had opinions about the fountain. She had opinions about the fountain. They had been arguing about it for 4 weeks, and she found that she was not interested in stopping. The pressure of the pen was entirely different from the last letter. "It will do," she wrote at the end. "It more than will do." Avenna read it and set it on the corner of the desk. Xavier came in from the corridor with 2 cups of tea. He set one beside her elbow without asking, without announcing, simply because her cup was empty, and he had noticed and done something about it. He sat across from her with his own cup and opened his council documents. While she did not look up from the border record she was reviewing, she picked up the tea. The autumn morning came through the library windows, pale and clear and entirely unremarkable. The fire was warm. The maps on the wall held their record under glass. Neither of them spoke for a while. The pack grounds outside were going through their ordinary business. The border school was open, the resource programs were running. The High Council had received its next round of strategic proposals, and 2 senior elders had written back to say the reasoning was the strongest they had seen in a decade, and neither of them had mentioned whose handwriting was on the attached survey notes. But both of them knew. Avenna reviewed her figures. Xavier reviewed his documents. The tea cooled at their elbows. Not this was what honest ground looked like in the ordinary light of a Tuesday morning. Not dramatic. Not announced. Just 2 people in a room, doing the work, with both their names on it. Then Avenna looked up at the north boundary map on the wall. "The 3rd section is still 4 yards off," she said. "I checked it against the creek markers on the Thursday walk." He looked up from his documents. "I walked that line for 3 hours." "You walked it for 3 hours and estimated 4 yards at the very end because the light was going and you thought I had stopped paying attention." "I thought I was always paying attention," she said. She said it simply, without edge, without accusation, simply as a fact. He looked at her. The map on the wall, the morning light, the tea in his hands. "Thursday," he said. "Must we go back Thursday and you show me the 4 yards?" "I will show you the 4 yards," she agreed. "And I will tell you that your measurement is off. And I will prove that my measurement is correct. And I will acknowledge it," he said. "Directly. Without finding the comfortable version first." "Without finding the comfortable version first," she confirmed. "That is the arrangement." They looked at each other across the desk, across the maps, across the ordinary autumn morning, and the 2 cups of tea, and the framed record on the wall, and everything that had been said and then built on. Neither of them was estimating from a distance. That was the arrangement. That was the whole story. 2 people who had spent 2 years in the same room, saying everything, except the one true thing, until one night, at above a celebration that had been arranged for someone else, in the lamplight of a room that had always held the most honest conversation either of them had ever managed, they finally said it. 7 words, undefended, without a case built around them. And the ground they built on afterward was not romantic or ceremonial or arranged with hawthorn garlands. It was a boundary survey on a Thursday morning, and a wrong figure corrected, and a cup of tea set beside an empty one without being asked. It was 2 sets of handwriting on every map. It was the argument stayed in, every time, without finding the comfortable version instead. It was the plain sentence, said plainly, built on daily. That was all. That was enough. That was everything.